Hey guys, so what's been happening in the hobby this week? Well, I thought we'd move on to, I guess, a lighter topic than last week, as I was ranting on about a pretty, I guess, you know, more serious topic of, depression and stuff like that. So this week we'll go on to a lighter topic. So I don't have any Soulblight Gravelord stuff painted or whatever to put in front of you, but I've got some of my own stuff from Blood of Gods. This is my necromantic faction. You can see I love Undead, so I just wanted to put that there as a as a nod to say that what we're going to talk about today is coming from a deep love of necromancy and undead and everything that goes along with that. I've always loved it, as well as within Warhammer. I've always loved it there too. Everything from the humble skeleton all the way up to your big liches and your necromancers and all the rest. So I'm big on that faction. As I said, I've made an entire brand based on it. So I've got a lot of investment in this. So the new Soulblight Gravelords has dropped, and I guess today we're going to talk about a little bit about my thoughts on Soulblight, or death as a faction in Warhammer at the moment, or in AOS, and maybe some of my thoughts on balance or on game design construction. And you might be asking, well, why do your thoughts matter? What and ultimately it doesn't. I mean, everyone makes their own mind up, right? I'm just one more voice on the internet talking about it. But I guess I do have some level of authority to speak, considering I've created my own game and my own brand and my own world of characters, and I'm not just making games, but I've already released one, a strategy card game. It's not a miniature tabletop game, but it still requires the same type of design, I guess, aesthetic and judgment calls and structures and so on that you do to balance out anything of these types of strategy type games. And so I've had some experience at it and actually producing a finished product. And currently, which is what these little ones are for, I am doing a board, like a tabletop game as well. So I'm working through that process. I'm by no means hugely successful at it or anything like that, but I've at least gone through the process of trying to complete one of these things, and so I have some idea. So I just want to throw out my little tiny version of what I think. As I said, it's just one voice on the internet. If you don't agree or whatever, that's totally fine. I'm just putting myself out there because as you can see, I really love undead stuff, and so I want to speak on it in mostly positive light. But I do feel like there's a few things that might have been missed opportunities from Games Workshop's point of view in terms of what they could have got out of the Soulblight Gravelords. So you can already tell that my my answers here to what I think is probably going to be a little bit mad, but it's still cool. It's all still cool. It's just some personal things. I think whenever you're invested in a faction, you always want the best for that faction, right? That's something that you always want. You want to see it do well and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, so let's get into it. So my initial thoughts on Soulblight Gravelords were that, like, in terms of the model, so we'll get that out of the way first. The sculptors have done an amazing job. The art team, the art direction, they're great. All of that stuff is great. That also lumps in a lot of the Cursed City stuff. Obviously, the direction for that Soulblight stuff was all probably done at the same time under similar art direction. And they've released all this stuff because there's a very, very similar feeling and flavor to it all, and it's really harkening back to the early days of vampire counts back in the early 2000s. That would have been like 6th edition Warhammer, and you see a lot of that influence there. They've really gone back to it, which is interesting because the whole point of AOS is to move away from that and do something crazy. And certainly, at least on the Vengorian Lord, the wacky one that either people love or hate. I'm in the love camp, other people are in the hate camp, but that's certainly out there for a Games Workshop model, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But apart from that model, and maybe some of the furry elements of wolf feet on a couple of the vampires there, but apart from that, there's not a lot of I guess push outside of the models when we look at the actual book. And so yeah, to start with, models are great. Vengorian Lord, super cool. And I think that's where most of the interesting things have come out of, is the design is cool in a new direction. Even with the gravestones on top of the zombies and all that kind of stuff, and the sort of roots that are growing out of them. They're trying to push their ideas a bit. But the Vengorian Lord is certainly something that is very different. It's a design choice that a smaller company would make. It's a very, very unusual choice for Games Workshop to make a sort of, from an anatomical speaking, just the way that they've decided to go with that, to put that into the main game, because that's really something that only like a smaller company would probably decide to do, not Games Workshop. And so that's really cool that they're trying to go with some different ideas and some different, even the wolf feet on the Vycross vampire lady on the wolf. That's a really sort of new thing for Games Workshop, really to play around with some of those ideas. So they are trying, like at least the design team and art team are trying to put in something unique, and generally speaking across the board, that's what they've done. So as I said, that's all great. But then we move on to the rules. Now the rules for me is where I think that they kind of fell short just a touch. And initially, I'll get it out of the way now, it is a good book, but it is middle of the road. And I'm not going to throw up the stats here. I'm not going to do all that because I'm not the best authority to be doing that. But if you go to any of the guys that are highly competitive and you look at their shows and their notes and their opinions on this, and I would generally go towards believing some of those thoughts and impressions, because they're gaming regularly and they're doing that. Obviously, again, you take it with a grain of salt. It's just one person's opinion. But if they are known to be successful tournament players and successful people in that space, then they do have some idea about how these books are and how strong they are and what they see as value out of that in terms of just a game mechanic side. And most of them do pit this as a 3-2, 3-win, 2-loss kind of situation, or a 4-1 if you're on a good day, or if you're extremely lucky and the meta is just right for you, you might get a 5-0, but it's unlikely. And so they're really a middle pack. And for the most part, as they even say on a lot of their YouTube videos, that's probably a healthy thing and a good thing for the game. However, this is at the start of a new edition, and as we all know, power creep is a thing. If anyone's in 40k, you know that is happening right now with Drukhari, and there's obviously a bit of a disparity there and some adjustments that need to be made. And so a middle of the road book that is coming out at the beginning of edition is unlikely to be very middle of the road once we get a year or year and a half or 2 years in. And that's where I've talked about this before on my news segment for this and so on, is at the end of the day, at least from my opinion, you really want to put in as much good structure into those rules as possible and make it, I would say you want to just push it to be a little bit stronger, like out the gate. So maybe it has a bit of a power spike in the beginning. And there are plenty of instances where they've done this that haven't totally gone awry or broken the system. Drukhari is not a good example, but something like, I think something like Death Guard in 40k is, that's a very nice book. It's got enough in there to be teethy and be competitive, but it's also not overdone, and they've done those little, and they could come in and do those little tweaks, like remove that ability off that one item, the Poxmonger one that allowed you to, they just changed that invulnerable save a bit. They just added like little tweaks here and there, but they could do that because the structure originally was already very good, and that way when they nerf it back, you don't see as much pushback. It still works. Same with like Be'lakor. As far as I know, in AOS, he was drastically underpointed, did a very good job. His one ability that everyone took him for, and that's why you saw him in all tournaments. Now he's been pointed up, and so less are going to take it. But for general competitive play, maybe not at the very top end of the spectrum, but for most people playing casual competitive games, he'll still be a good choice, and even in some tournament armies too. So you'll still see him around, even though he's now pointed a bit and his rules have changed slightly, but it's still good enough because his basic structure was relatively good. And so that's what I'm really talking about when I'm saying about coming out a bit more powerful out of the gate. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. Because essentially it allows the designers to come back in and tweak things. If you already start from a mediocre base, or from a base that's not really quite got the teeth in it that it needs to be competitive, then it never will, because they're not going to go back and remake those rules. They do in some cases, but it might be a year or two away before you see it. You know what I mean? Like if you look at the case of the Maggotkin one, well, it's not even Maggotkin, it's the demons from that faction from Nurgle. You know, they did an amazing job with those new the Sloppity Bolepiper and all of that. They're great for those two units that they did. Well, there's the third one, but the main two, those two buff characters, and they're great rules. But that's like a long time on from when that first book was released, and for Nurgle, Maggotkin was one of the first. You know, it's a very big gap. And so that's the issue about that sort of stuff, is that they will go back and redo some of those, but it just requires more work. And so I still feel like you want to come on a little stronger. That also helps their sales, everything else like that, you know, and that's a thing, right? And who doesn't want their faction to be good? And so I feel like that's where, you know, they just wanted to have, they had so much potential, and also to make it more interesting. So part of that structure and that powerful thing is not just about making individual units great, but making the army as a whole have more play, like in terms of the units that are in it all are valid, or as many of them as possible, in as many combinations as possible. I know that's a tall ask. As I said, I've been doing my own designing, and it is a very difficult thing to manage that type of thing on a scale like what Warhammer is. It must be even more difficult than what I'm finding with my small game. You know, it is a problem, but they do have the resources and the infrastructure to kind of work through these issues, and they've done it now for many generations. So they do have a precedent, and they do have experience at this type of thing, as opposed to, you know, smaller companies or individual artists like myself trying to do this. So they should have a better time of it, you would think. And so one of those things is, if they just make that little bit of push, then they can come back in, and it's a simple thing of, like, you know, maybe fixing like points values or subtle adjustments here and there to certain special rules, and then you can basically get it in line more or less. But still, it could be a little bit competitive. And something like Soulblight, where you have all these vampire bloodlines, I mean, there's so much potential there for interesting play styles, but to me, I'm not really seeing it in that book. They're all kind of a bit similar, and there's not that much variation. I might be wrong on that, but from what I'm seeing from everyone that's been analysing this book that I've watched, I haven't seen anything that really blows me out of the water. And I think the main problem is because they haven't pushed in any one direction. So you vampire guys are going to be happy with the models, but not as excited by the rules as much, knowing how middle of the road those rules are, and then and the play styles. And then the people on the other side, like me, that are the more the necromantic type of stuff, you know, there's basically no really high level magic user for a necromancer. There's just a necromancer, and that's it. There's no special characters, there's nothing. You can't, you know, get any kind of character like that in the book. It's like out of the book. And a lot of the vampires even aren't even wizards. They don't cast anything. So it's like you've got like a one caster basically for everything, and there's no I mean, that might be the way the game is going generally. If every other book is like that, then fine, whatever, it's going to even out. But I don't believe that's the case. I don't think that at all. I think they're just missing out a little bit here on what they could be, and pushing that whole idea of AOS being out there. They could have really pushed these things into very large directions. Like, there's no bloodline for a magic style, and that's one of the big principles of Undead. You know, of any lore system in any IP. You know, Undead is based on necromancy, on the power of the magic, the magic user that's controlling all of these reanimated corpses and these spirits and all that kind of stuff. It's like a really integral part of what makes Undead. Without that key component, it's a virus zombie movie, apocalyptic movie, right? But that's not what it is in fantasy. Fantasy, it's not a virus running around making them all crazy. It's a magical entity behind them, a supernatural presence which is controlling and the will of that user controlling this animation in some way, right? Whatever type of entity that is, whether it's a necromancer, a vampire, or whatever, but it's being done through force of will and these magical, you know, spells that are going off to create this army of the undead. and I'm just not really seeing that vibe in a lot of it. Little bits of it is there, but often, see, if we look at something like Manfred and Neferata, they're already got like decent war scrolls before, and these are just tweaked ones. So you can see they're also really awesome, and Manfred's like the really cool one, right? But they're already pretty good. So that's again an example of where you're seeing good structure and good design. Even through new editions, it barely needs any changes. They haven't really been given that much of a change, and they're still great. That's good design. That's coming off really well, and they have their own distinct way that they play. But are you going to see that with any of the other vampire lines? I don't think so. I think that whatever design principles and aesthetics they were applying to those two characters and to that time period is not happening during this edition, as far as I can see. So it is a bit of a shame, because I was hoping for some kind of magical side to this that would be fun to go down, but there really isn't there. It's still there, but it's not as much as what I would have expected. So that, I guess that's my negative take on that, and I guess we'll have to wait for another edition to see it. But the positives are that we've still got Ossiarch Bone Reapers and Flesh Eater Courts and Nighthaunt to come, and anything else they decide to add outside of that. And so for me at the moment, the Ossiarchs and the Flesh Eater Courts really are showing the most, I guess, traditional forms of undead in terms of the way they play. You've got a very kind of, I guess, potentially magic shooting base, like an old school undead army from Ossiarch, more or less, and high armor values, and a bit of a difference, but there is a lot of that traditional stuff in there, like a Khemri army or something, like Tomb Kings. And then you've got the Flesh Eater Courts have a lot of this mustering ability and summoning, and so you're almost getting that kind of feeling of a necromantic army, even though they're not very good at magic, but because they have that mustering ability, it makes up for it and gets you the sense or the feeling of that kind of overwhelming numbers coming on. And so you still have it there within Death, but it doesn't feel like it's coming from Soulblight anymore. So yeah, I don't know, they're just in a weird spot to me. It doesn't quite feel like they nailed the real feeling. A good example of something that, although it is overpowered or whatever in the meta right now, or is a strong army, but really nails the feeling of what that army should be, would be something like Tzeentch, right? Because they have that because they have those destiny dice, right? That's the AOS? I'm not getting this confused, right? But they have dice where they can influence rolls and stuff like that. Just like in 40k, you have Sister of Battle have their miracle dice, and so the ability for Tzeentch to play outside the rules a little bit feels really appropriate, because they're a cheater, right? It's the changer of ways. He's cheating to get his ends done, and I feel like even though they're a powerful army, it really is in sync with the core, I guess, character of what that army is, and the books that do that the best often are the strongest. Even though, if you really take a look at it, not all of the rules inside the book are necessarily powerful. But usually a lot of the units are playable. Another great example, coming back to 40k, would be, again, Death Guard. I just think what they've done with that is great, because for years Nurgle and basically in both games, whether it's fantasy or 40k, suffered from this kind of problem of only considering one aspect of how they are, and that is the slow, purposeful thing and the resilience thing. Yes, they are that, but they're also a lot of other things too. And you can see how AOS tried to put that in to make them fast. So they've got that ability to slingshot with the trees and all that kind of stuff, and that gives you the sense of the fast-moving kind of zombie apocalypse thing, right? Which is in that, or a fast-moving contagion. Viruses move very quickly. That's another aspect of Nurgle, and that's something that you can really dive into. And they've started to do that with AOS. They have that concept that's in there, but it is now in the Death Guard rules, and they have a lot of their units have play. The Haulers, I've spoke about this before in other talks. Going from the 100-point mark to 140-point mark isn't actually that big of a deal, because the core structure of the rules for that unit are very good. They're not great for every single type of Death Guard list, but they are very solid rules and a very solid unit that does give you play. Same with a Plague Burst Crawler. You may love it or hate it, depending on how dynamic you like to play, but it has a really key function in the army and does fit in really well. And no matter really what they do with it, it still ends up being a really core fundamental part. And so much so that other Chaos armies would soup them in because of how good of an anchor they are. So we can see there, in fact, most competitive lists, if you look at them, all use some form of Nurgle unit in them. Like almost always, whether they be Nurglings or whatever, they're all using them because they're finally, I guess, nailing that character to design, to structure. Synergy is just happening right now. So whoever's been in their design teams and all that for the last few years really has understood how to access Nurgle, and I would say Tzeentch as well, for a lot of Tzeentch anyway. And I'm really curious to see when we see Thousand Suns, just to get off the AOS topic a bit and move into the Thousand Suns thing. When that comes, it'll be really interesting to see how they go with that, and then Chaos as a whole there, because I think that all that stuff is going to influence drastically how AOS handles their Chaos factions and how that comes across in terms of synergizing their character. And so when we move back to Soulblight here, that's what I think they might have just missed a little bit. I still think they're cool. I think they'll still be fun to play with, and they'll still be, really cool. But ultimately, I think it still doesn't quite hit the mark. When you look at those models and you look at the rules, something's not really quite, hitting it as well. But again, we have the possibility of some great rules coming for the other death factions, and then you can maybe soup them in, just ally in other stuff that you want to build a better list. And because those armies are going to come much later in the process, so they're going to have more time to have spent figuring these things out, coming up with new ideas to innovate, and you'll get those stronger books. And that always happens, unless they were very good at the start and given some structure. So, for instance, Magikeen, although they're not in the top, they still do perform. You still see them in tournaments, which means that something in their base structure is correct because it's still being seen. If it wasn't, you would never really see it. And because in the end, if you're going to compete, you're going to choose an army that's going to give you that ability to compete. Even if you're a die-hard fan of one faction, you probably still will move over to another one for a while that one is languishing a bit. But even with Magikeen, we still see that they're being played, which means that they do have some play, right? So that's just my thoughts on that. I know I've been ranting on a little bit and crossing between 40k and AOS, and even my own stuff. But yeah, it's cool. It's a good book. I think it'll be fun. But I am more excited to see what they do for the later death factions and how they play, and really what kind of rules AOS 3 is compared to AOS 2, because I found trying to get into AOS 2 a little bit convoluted compared to 40k. I found getting back into 40k like really easy and understandable, but AOS there's a bit of disconnect there, and so I'm hoping they're learning lessons from 8th to 9th edition that they've now done into AOS 3 to help maybe just iron out some of that stuff. And from the sounds of it, it is going that way. We've got like most probably standardized battalions and stuff like that, which I think is way better for match play and for competitive play, even just for casual games, just to standardize it a bit. I think that's a massive win for the game. And hopefully the reduction in size as well. I actually really do enjoy playing on the small size. I never thought that'd be a thing, like, so many years, decades of playing on those normal 6x4 boards or 8x4 boards, and then going into a smaller size. You don't think you're going to like it, but I think it actually helps the game a lot, especially for AOS, where you don't have as many units on the board. It's a much smaller game generally. You almost every army and every single faction, as far as I can see, you have a centerpiece model, which is usually a huge amount of points, which you would never see back in the day. Like you'd never drop that many points on a big unit like that, very rarely. But these days you do, because of all the buffs and the way that they work. And then you have usually one big brick unit that's your punch or whatever, and then you'll have a few smaller units around it and almost nothing else. And some armies have even less than that, which is just amazing to me. It's how different the composition is compared to fantasy. And so, what that means is that a smaller board size is going to make that feel more intense, and there'll be less gaps and a little bit more. I believe it'll end up being more tactical and more considered, and things like, even though deep strikes become a little harder in some cases, but a lot of the deep striking in AOS, from what I can see, is where you're moving on from a board edge, and at the moment it doesn't seem like, for instance, Flesh Eater Courts, it doesn't seem very powerful to have something coming on 6 inches or whatever it is from a board edge that's 6 foot long, unless you've got a mission where there's enough objectives on the table where you can reach one. You're almost never going to do that because it's not impacting enough on the game for it to be worthwhile. A deep strike would be better, like, where it's coming down 9 inches from an enemy anywhere on the board. That's a nice one. But when you're coming on a board edge, that's too far away. But a smaller board, that's probably going to be more useful. In theory, it should be. Whether it is or not depends on what the new mission packs are and how they work and everything. But ultimately, it should be a little better for AOS in that situation, for armies like that function that way. So that is a positive, right? There's some good things there coming for Undead for those types of things and structures, if it ends up being what we see in AOS 3, which I hope so. Because I'm certainly, as much as 40k has their power creep and what's happening with Drukhari at the moment, it is still, I think, the best edition of the game they've made. Just from the rules point of view and the way you play, I think it's very good. I think it's really enjoyable. They just have that issue of trying to control this power creep and how strong they make armies when they come out of the gate, and that's always a problem. But we've seen it every edition, so it's nothing new. It's not like a new thing that's only to this edition. It's every single edition of the game since it was begun. There's always been that, right? It's a constant, but it's about how they rein it in and how responsive they are to changing things and to keeping things in balance. And they seem to be much better at it these days. As I've said, I think I've talked about this before, but back in the day, you wouldn't get any kind of FAQ. You'd have to wait for a new edition, and that'd be like 5 years away, because they didn't do a 3-year turnaround back then. It was a 5-year or 6-year turnaround, right? So you're not going to get any rules changes for like most of your experience in the hobby. You're just going to have the same rule set, and if you're lucky, you'll get a White Dwarf article that might do something for you. But pretty much they just didn't even do anything back then. So you're in a much better situation now because they're regularly bringing out FAQs and changes, which is a massive thing. And I believe that will just continue as they get bigger and more mainstream. They will try to make this game as accessible and as balanced and work as well for all levels of gameplay, not just your competitive but your casual as well. And that's the inclusion of things like those themed books and themed battalions and stuff, which will end up being more for casual play and narrative, which is what it's looking like. And then your match play will be a little bit more streamlined in terms of how you basically battalions that have buffs that everyone gets. So that's good, because that means you only have to remember so many of them, right? You have to remember like a million different things, because one of the problems that I see with AOS compared to the old edition, at least from the outside looking in, is by removing a lot of the stats and comparative stats on your stat lines, which seems cool in theory and all that kind of stuff, but that means that the real difference that units have is in their special rules and not in their stats, mostly, because most things start with a 3-4 or a 4-4 or in that middle range, and then you use various special rules layered on top of each other to get those 2s to hit, 2s to wound, or whatever you want to get, right, to get the powerful stat line. And so that means you need to remember a lot more. You've got to remember like a sentence to a paragraph of information, and lots of them, and over lots of armies, to figure out what's negatively hitting you and positively hitting you, to figure out what your role is. Whereas before, there was less of that stacking sort of stuff in some cases, and you were remembering, at least on a baseline, the comparative stat of you versus them, and then you're only looking at, then sort of a bit more, I don't know, it just feels a bit more logical to remember like what the power level of that unit is, by knowing, okay, it's got toughness 5, so it's going to be XYZ kind of level, generally speaking, except with debuffs and so on. But you could still get a better baseline or initiative, whatever, weapon skill, so on. You understand more about how strong that base structure is for that unit, as opposed to what you have now, at least from my opinion, looking from the outside in. But we'll see how it goes. If they can do some of those elements to standardize some of the other structure that's around it, so you're not remembering so much of that stuff, and you're getting a bit more on your war scroll that's sort of more contained within that war scroll, and you can understand it better and see the value in it without needing to remember all this other stuff coming into it. I think that'll be better for new players, and just generally make the game a bit more flow a little bit better, I think, anyway. But otherwise, that's my thoughts on Soulblight and AOS in general at the moment. I'm still really excited to get into it. As I said, I haven't played my first game yet, but I'm hoping to soon. I've been doing a bunch of work. Here, I'll show you something cool, little preview. This will be on my hobby vlog next week, or this week, which you'll see in that. But I've just been doing some test stuff on, Stormcast, because I'm assuming these guys are going to be super cool, the Marines of fantasy, hopefully, and that'll mean that they'll play really well and be a fun one to have as a gaming army. So this is my gaming, I guess, standard for them. It's really fast to do, but I'll be showing more on this as the weeks come on. I'll probably do a tutorial on how to do it, because I really love the brass that came up on this. I think it's really cool. But yeah, just a little sneaky preview there. And otherwise, I guess that's it. So have a great day. Hope this has been informative and you've enjoyed it. Hit that like button, subscribe button if you have, and I'll catch you on the next one.